so much for Nate Petersen and just all of his wisdom and knowledge and, his ability to share with all of us. God, I just pray that you would bless him this morning and that, our hearts would be open to continuing hearing from Nate. And, would you just mark us this morning? Holy Spirit, would you be with us? Thank you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. So we're going to fly through a bunch of Genesis today, hopefully answer all of these questions at one point, and start in on Exodus today as well. So it's going to be interesting. The reason I wanted to spend, like I said, most of our time yesterday, all of our time really, on chapters 1 and 2 is because the story that's told, really, or the message that's told in Genesis 1 and 2 is repeated all throughout the rest of Genesis. It's different characters, different settings, but the story and the message is kind of the same. And so that's kind of where I want to go today. And mostly we'll just spend most of our time looking at Abraham, because Abraham is really the center of the story of Genesis. He's the main guy. And if it's not Abraham, it's somebody from Abraham's family. Because when we talked yesterday about the fact that Genesis means beginning, it's more than just the beginning of the world or the beginning of the material creation, but it's really the beginning of God's redemptive plan for mankind. And the beginning of that plan really starts in a new way, or a new creation, starts in a new way with Abraham. And so Abraham is kind of the guy that all Israelites would always look back to, and Abraham's covenant. Thanks, Pacific Waste, guys. But we're going to look at Abraham today. And one of the things that people ask me oftentimes, I was talking with my wife last night about Genesis, and we're reading through Isaiah, so, we're kind of getting into some things with Isaiah. She was asking, we were talking about other things in the Old Testament, and one of the things that she asked, and a lot of other people ask, is, well, how could you understand that if you don't have somebody teach you, or you haven't studied it? How could you understand that? It doesn't really seem fair. But I want to encourage you guys. Some of the stuff that we talk about here, this is stuff that I'm pulling it from people that have studied it their whole lives, and they're pulling it from people who have studied it their whole lives. But I want to encourage you guys that the main message of the Bible is clear and simple enough that a child could understand it. And so it's not like you have to go through a DBS or an SBS or seminary to understand what God is saying in the Bible. What's fun about it, though, is it's eternal, and there's so many layers to it that we can just keep digging and have a lot of fun with it. But I don't want you guys to feel like this is something that you have to have gone through school or something like that to get. I have multiple stories of friends of mine who were living a complete life of sin and rebellion, and they opened up the Bible one night, and, two friends actually in particular, they both read the book of John, which is funny because they didn't know each other, still don't know each other, but they read through the book of John, and overnight God transformed their life just because they understood the simple gospel in the Gospel of John. And so this isn't like high, lofty stuff that nobody can understand. If we can understand just the basics of the Bible, we've got it, and anybody can understand that. But the reason I think God leaves so many layers to his word is once we understand the basic gospel, we understand what it means to be a Christian and how to have salvation, then we can spend the rest of our lives studying this stuff and going deeper and deeper and debating and finding out new information. The stance that I have on the book of Genesis right now, at least as far as, some of these details, it could change, in 20 years from now if there's new discoveries, but the message in it will never change. All right, the message that God created mankind, created them to have a relationship with him, and we messed it up, and yet he's going to be the one to fix it. That's been the constant message ever since this book was written. Nobody has really debated that, even though they may have debated some of the details. And so I just want to encourage you guys with that. It really makes Bible study very liberating and very fun, because as long as we can agree on the basics, man, we can just go all over the place sometimes with the details, and talk with each other and go back and forth and just have fun with it. And so, like I said, throughout the rest of the book of Genesis, we kind of see this same cycle that we saw at the beginning. See if this is going to work for us. There we go. All right, so this is a lot of information here, but it's kind of this cycle of creation, fall, punishment, and then a new creation. You're going to see a very similar cycle to this when you guys get to the book of Judges as well. But in the Garden of Eden, at the very beginning, God creates this perfect place, relationship with people, but mankind falls. They ate the fruit, they sinned. And so God, here we go. Got it down here. God kicks them out of the garden, all right? But before he kicks them out of the garden, he leaves them with a promise in Genesis 3:15. And this is the very first messianic promise that we have in the Bible, is just three chapters in. This is when he promises that the offspring of the woman, at some point, even though the serpent will strike his heel, he will crush the head of the serpent. And this was understood later in the Gospels to be a prophecy about Jesus. All right, and so Jesus would be the offspring of the woman. He would be the one to crush the serpent's head, or in other words, he would defeat Satan. He would defeat sin. And even though Satan would strike his heel, which is kind of an allusion to when Jesus was on the cross. But anyways, we've got this cycle. God creates, has an act of creation, gives people purpose, but mankind rebels. God has to kick them out of the garden. As a consequence of their sin, they are not able to live in this covenant relationship with God. And that's an important thing to remember as well, that all of these covenants that at least in the Old Testament, that God places or God comes into with people, there are these conditional covenants where they need to be obedient to God in order to remain in relationship with him. But even though there's punishment, God promises restoration. We see kind of the same thing with the flood in the story of Noah. God takes care of mankind, even though they've been kicked out of the garden. God is taking care of them, and there's some righteous people. There's Noah and his family. But once again, mankind falls into sin. Mankind decides that they know better than God, and they want to rule themselves instead of God ruling over them. And so in the story of Noah, we have this interesting statement. Where did it go here? Oh, it says in our some translations it said God regrets that he made mankind. So that phrase, God regrets, is kind of an interesting phrase. It's one thing where it's like, wait a second, if God knows everything, how could God regret anything, right? I mean, like, it's not like he made a mistake. It's like, should have thought that all the way through kind of a thing. But that phrase, or that word, God regrets, that's also used in that Hebrew phrase is also used later on in the book of Exodus. Moses goes up onto the mountain, he gets the law, he gets the 10 Commandments, and he comes down, and the Israelites are worshiping this golden calf. And so God is so upset, God's so angry, that God wants to destroy the Israelites. So it's very, very similar to the story of Noah, and we'll kind of see this cycle repeat all the way throughout the Pentateuch. But God actually, and it kind of uses that same language there, that God regrets that he saved them. It says that he wants to destroy them. But something interesting happens. Moses prays to the Lord, and it says that God changed his mind. And actually that phrase there, changed his mind, is the same phrase that's used when it says God regretted making mankind. And so there's something going on there. Again, it seems weird for us to hear the phrase God changed his mind. And it's almost like, well, does Moses have like control over God? Like Moses, made God change his mind. But with that word, actually, it's kind of a hard one to translate into English. But the most literal sense is it's almost like God sighs in a way. It's like it's like the humans made this bad choice, and God was just like, like, almost like, what are you doing? Like, why are you making these choices? Why are you rebelling against me? Why are you choosing death and rebellion instead of choosing life and obedience? And so it's kind of that same phrase there. It's a harder one to understand with the English translation. So it's not like God, like I said, God didn't think it all the way through and was like, man, I should not have done that. I should not have made mankind. But it's almost like God is looking out on mankind, these people made in his image. that are not reflecting his image and are not loving one another, and they're not spreading his kingdom. And it's almost like God is just, and the phrase in Hebrew when he sighs, it's like just a sigh, but not just like, but it's like a sigh in your innermost being. Like you're just so hurt almost that like people are making these decisions, and so hurt that they're doing this, that you're just, it's really it's upsetting to God in a way. And so it's kind of a tough thing to understand, or tough thing, because I don't fully understand it either. But that's kind of what it means when it says that God regrets. It's kind of the closest thing in our English language. But when we're talking about a sovereign God, it seems weird that, you know, he would regret something, at least in the same sense that we think of regret. I don't know if that helps at all with that. It's one of those things where we might not actually ever really have a fully perfect explanation of that phrase. But that's kind of more what it means. More just like God is really deeply internally upset that people are making these decisions. So, if you do a word study of that, so if you check it here, let me write down a really good resource for you guys. And I use this even to this day. There's a website called Blue Letter Bible. And Blue Letter Bible has different translations and different versions of the Bible on there. But what you can do is you can type in a verse, and you can highlight that verse, and it'll break it all down in the original language. And you can click on each word, and you can see the definition. You can see other places in the Bible that it's used. And they'll have different commentaries and stuff on it. I don't think you can use the commentaries like for your homework and stuff like that. But this is really helpful just to see how those different words are used, and kind of helps bring some clarity to it. It's also really interesting sometimes to see other places where that particular phrase is used, because in languages like Hebrew and Greek, and also English too, I guess, certain words can have different meanings, and very specific meanings, or you could have like 3 different options of words to choose for like what you want to say, and all the authors very specifically choose some of these words. And so that is a really helpful resource. They have an app too, blueletterbible.com.
It's pretty valid, you say?
Yeah. I would say. I mean, we've been using it in the SBS for a long time. I mean, that doesn't automatically validate things, but yeah, I mean, it's run by people that are much smarter. You know that it's run by, at least I assume that it's run by people that know what they're doing and have probably been doing it for a long time, because the website looks kind of old, but if they're older people doing it, they've probably been doing this for a long time. But yeah, it's pretty legit, Blue Letter Bible. Okay, and so God, this is a real quick recap of the flood story, but God's taking care of mankind. Mankind falls into sin. God is upset, or he regrets that he made mankind, and he sends the flood, which is interesting because, as we saw yesterday, the flood waters were kind of this symbol of disorder and the symbol of chaos. It was bad, all right? Floods represented disorder. But it shows that Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, is in charge even of flood waters, all right? Floods were seen as a sign that the gods were like asleep at the wheel, kind of a thing. Like the gods aren't paying attention, and now disorder and chaos is taking over. But what God is showing is that God actually is in charge of this disorder, and he's actually using disorder, or the flood, to start again and to bring order. And so the disorder really is not a matter of like the waters below or above or anything like that. But what God is showing is that the disorder and the chaos is actually in the hearts of the people. And God has to deal with the people and deal with their sin in order for things to get better. And even though God brings punishment, God starts again with Noah. And so God made a covenant with Adam after he had to, or right before he punished him and sent him out of the garden. But God also makes a covenant with Noah. And it's this covenant that God is going to restore fully the earth at one point. He kind of isolates the problem. He says, I won't ever destroy the earth again because of sin, because he's like, if I destroyed the earth every time you were sinful, he's like, I'd have to destroy the earth every day. And so what God is saying is that this problem is a heart problem. There's something deep down inside of you that's a problem. And that's going to be one of the questions that the Israelites have coming out of Egypt. Like, why is the world the way that it is? What is sin? Like, why do we do things that are wrong? And why are we not in the promised land? Why are we not in a perfect relationship with Yahweh like Adam and Eve were? And he's saying it's because there's an issue in your heart. And so when he lays down the law, when you guys get to some places in Exodus and Leviticus, you'll see really that at the heart of all those laws is just that. It's the heart. God's looking at the people's heart because that's really where the issue is. I promised you guys yesterday that I would take a look at this story of Noah and ruin it for you guys. Some of you might have already heard this already or looked at this. I heard Leilani kind of gave some of this away already, but that's okay. So let's take a look at what's going on with Noah. This is one of those questions that I get a lot, is why is it such a big deal that Noah's son, sees his dad naked? Was it just a cultural thing? But let's take a look at what's going on here. This is after the flood, Genesis chapter 9. We'll start in verse 20. Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, which is important to note here that the author specifically says the father of Canaan, saw, or in other words, uncovered the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. All right, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." All right, and so I've got two little boys, and I try to remember to lock the door all the time, but it doesn't always happen. So like maybe I'm taking a shower or whatever, trying to go to the bathroom. If one of my kids walked in because I didn't lock the door, I'm not going to curse them, all right? I'm also not going to curse their children because you'll notice that he doesn't curse Ham. He curses Canaan, who is Ham's son. And he says, he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And so Noah kind of has this very serious reaction to what Ham does, and so that causes people to ask, like, what is it that Ham did that was so bad? It's a busy day on campus today. I don't want the Kona Trans guy to have to hear this, so... No, so this is just one of the theories that's out there. And what was your name again? Abraham. You kind of mentioned this yesterday. You kind of alluded to this. So one of the things that's interesting is here it says, when Noah woke up and knew what his youngest son had done to him, it seems like he just walked in and like glanced on his dad. I was like, oh no, my eyes. But if we, and I don't have the particular verses in Leviticus here. I'll have to get those to you guys tomorrow. But I think it's in Leviticus 17 or 18. I think 17. But anyways, God is going over a list of sexual sins in the book of Leviticus. And one of the sins in Leviticus is sleeping with your mom or your auntie or, your sister and stuff like that. In the Hebrew language, there's actually no word for sex. They don't have a word for it. They just use euphemisms. So that's why I'll say, like, Adam knew his wife, or David lay with his wife, or something like that. There's no actual word for sexual intercourse in Hebrew. And so what they use is euphemisms. And actually one of the euphemisms that they use is the phrase uncover nakedness. And so in Leviticus it says, do not uncover the nakedness of your mother because it is the nakedness of your father. And so there's a couple different interpretations that scholars will give to this. The first one would be that if Ham uncovered his dad's nakedness, it could potentially mean that Ham actually slept with his dad, which would be why Noah would wake up and realize what his son had done to him. which, like I said, really ruins the story of Noah and his kids for us. Another theory, which I think actually makes a little bit more sense, is, and this would explain why he curses Canaan, Ham's son, is it could be that when it says he uncovered his father's nakedness, it could mean that he slept with his mom, which doesn't make it any better, slept with his mom, and possibly Canaan was the offspring of that incestuous relationship, and that's why Canaan is cursed instead of Ham. None of it is pretty. None of it makes us feel warm and fuzzy inside, but it's probably a little more than just walking in. I mean, it was shameful to see your father. It was shameful to be. That's why they wore dresses all the time. That's why it was shameful for men to run. That's why you couldn't build high places to worship God, because if you're walking upstairs, your skirt's gonna blow up and stuff like that. So that's why all the altars of God had to be on level ground. And so it's just that's one of those are a couple interpretations of what's going on there. And the third one would just be, simply like he got really upset that his son walked in and saw him naked and didn't do anything about it. That's the one that I really hope that it is. But then it makes, like I said, it makes a little more sense that Canaan would be cursed instead of Ham. And so when we say that too, it's important to remember that when we say Canaan was cursed, it's not like Noah was taking his anger out on his grandson and should have punished Ham, but punished his grandson instead. When it says that he will be cursed, the language there, it's more like this is now the outcome. Because you did this, your son is now going to have to go through problems. Not because I'm making him, but it's almost this statement that this is going to make life hard for your son because comes from this, ungodly relationship. It's the same in the book of Exodus when he says that, if you obey the commands of God, you will be blessed. Your children will be blessed to the 1,000th generation. But if you disobey, your children will be cursed to the 3rd and 4th generation. It's not, in the language there, it's not that God is actively cursing your children because you disobeyed and because that would be very unjust. But he's just saying this is the outcome. If you live in disobedience and you live in sin, your children will pay the price for that. I mean, think of if you have, and some of us might, if you have an alcoholic parent, and studies show that most likely kids that grow up with an alcoholic parent will suffer from some sort of addictive behavior when they get older. It's not a generational curse. It's not something that they don't necessarily have a choice in, but because that's how they were raised, they are going to lean more towards that. And that's what God is saying. It's not like God is unjustly punishing the sons of these people. He's just saying, look, when you raise your kids in this kind of a lifestyle, that's what they're going to know, and they're going to have to go through a lot more suffering even than you. Because you're old and you're probably going to die soon, but your kids are really going to be the ones to pay the price for this. And that's true even today. And that's just the issue with sin, really. It's another illuminating scene on what sin does. Sin, and I think God's trying to communicate this, is sin does not just affect you. It does affect you, but sin affects everybody around you. And we'll see that so clearly when the Israelites are wandering around in the wilderness. That sin is something, it's internal, it's in your heart, but it's going to affect everybody around you. And that's what happens with Noah's kids here. But Noah starts again with Noah. So after the flood, and it's interesting because in the creation account, the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters, all right? Chaotic, formless, void. The same thing the earth looked like during the flood, all right? But God raises the land up again out of the flood, and so Noah is almost like this new Adam, a new creation. We're starting over. And then the Tower of Babel, which is a kind of a weird story. We don't have a whole lot of time to get into it. But God, again, saves mankind through Noah, has a new creation, makes a covenant with Noah. And yet mankind decides that they're going to band together and they're going to build a tower to God. They're going to build this temple. And back then, temples were made so that gods could come down to mankind. This was made so that mankind could go up to God, really to overthrow him and to replace him. And so mankind tries to reach God, and God punishes mankind with confusion or disorder. Again, God is using disorder to bring about the order that he sees fit. But then he starts over with Abraham. And that's kind of where we get to today. And it's interesting because, like I said, Adam and Eve were cast out to the east, which is towards Babylon, or what turned into Babylon. And Babel was in the east, and Babel is the Hebrew word for Babylon, or where Babylon comes from. So all of the evil is going east, and yet God is bringing people out of the east back to the promised land. And you're going to see that even all throughout the Old Testament in the prophets. When people go into exile, they go into exile in the east. They go to Babylon, and yet God brings them back from the east into the promised land. So it's the same story over and over again throughout the Old Testament. But God starts over again with Abraham, and this is where everything in the book of Genesis just comes to a screeching halt. I mean, we just flew over thousands of years of history. And now we get to Abraham, and the rest of the story is about Abraham and his descendants. But a little bit about Abraham, and I'm hoping that some of this background information about Abraham will help to kind of answer some of these questions. If Abraham's such a great guy, why did he sleep with his maidservant? Why did he lie about his wife and say that she was his sister and basically just hand her over to the king of Egypt? I'm not going to stand here and try to justify his actions, but hopefully we can understand a little bit of where he's at. It's really easy to take some of these people like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even Moses, and just kind of hold them up on this pedestal. I think these are the fathers of our faith. These guys were great, righteous people. But then when we do that, when we unjustly hold them up on a pedestal and they do something like polygamy, then we start asking questions like, well, why is God okay with polygamy? When in fact God was never okay with polygamy, but God is working with broken, imperfect people, and it takes a process for these guys to get to where they were later on in life. But Abraham is from Ur. And we'll take a look at a map here in a second and see why that's significant. But Ur is in the east. Yes, Randy.
I was dealing with somebody recently on the issue of slavery. He's using that to justify his sin. God feels so bad. And so I was praying and I felt like the Lord said, it's the same as divorce. It was not, Jesus said, it wasn't this way in the beginning.
Yeah.
And if we take it back to God's original, there wasn't polygamy, it was just you take slavery back to the original, there was no slavery in the garden.
Yeah.
Many things that stumble people can go back to that. This was never how God intended it. This is God's response to how bad we've screwed it up.
Yeah, which is a really good point. And it's a really amazing aspect of God. God lays out his law and tells us what he expects of us, but then he also, in a way, he's like, I know that you're not going to do this, and so I'm still going to, he makes these covenants with people, but then he follows them up with these promises to, basically, God's going to be the one to fulfill them. In the book of Deuteronomy, the whole book of Deuteronomy is about how God should be the king of Israel, and they should not want any earthly kings because he's their king, and he's the perfect king. And yet in Deuteronomy 17, I think, God lays out all the rules for what an earthly king should look like in Israel. And so it's like he knows that they're not going to go along with him. He knows that they're going to reject him, and he still works with them and takes care of them. So that's a really good point. In the beginning, God said he created male and female, and he says for that, and they became one flesh, and for that reason a man shall leave his parents or leave his mother and cleave to his wife. And so it's one male and one female. And so polygamy was never in God's mind. God never approves of polygamy. But it is interesting that even though we see polygamy in the Old Testament, it never turns out well for those people. Many of the people in the Old Testament where it's the author specifically tells us they have multiple wives, it never turns out well for them. It doesn't turn out well for Abraham. It doesn't turn out well for David. It doesn't turn out well for Isaac or Jacob. It doesn't turn out well for these guys. But God still works with them. All right? And so Abraham is from Ur, and Abraham worshipped idols. The author of Hebrews tells us that in Hebrews chapter 11. All right, Abraham was a pagan. Abraham was not Jewish. That's one thing I always try to remind people. All right, Abraham was not a Jew. He was not Jewish. He was likely a polytheist, which means that he likely believed in many gods or worshipped many gods. Actually, probably more pantheist than polytheist, but But that's probably why Abraham responded to Yahweh the first time that God spoke to him. It wasn't because he was super righteous. It was just because he thought oh, look, here's another God. I should probably listen to him. And the reason that Abraham probably obeyed is that he thought, he would get something good out of it, which he did. But it's interesting to note that God never really changes Abraham's mind, at least not right away. God does not show up to Abraham and say, hey, I want a relationship with you, and in order for you to have a relationship with me, you need to quit serving these other gods, you need to, not be a polygamist, you need to do all this. Abraham never gets the law downloaded into his mind or anything, but God just meets him right where he's at, and God has grace and space, as we say sometimes, to work with Abraham, and he allows Abraham to grow, and by the end of Abraham's life, he's a pretty decent guy, but it takes a while for him to get there. But God doesn't require Abraham to immediately change and immediately be a perfect person. He just asks Abraham to put a little bit of faith in him, and God takes that faith and changes him into the father of this great nation. And so, God does not immediately download these laws and morals. All that Abraham has to do is respond to God. John Walton and a guy named Victor Matthew write this about Abraham. It says, the Lord Yahweh is not portrayed as a God that Abraham had already worshipped. When he appears to Abraham, he does not give him a doctrinal statement or require rituals or issue demands. He makes an offer. Yahweh does not tell Abraham that he is the only God there is, and he does not ask him to stop worshiping whatever gods his family is worshiping. He does not tell him to get rid of his idols, nor does he proclaim a coming Messiah or salvation. Instead, he says that he has something to give Abraham if Abraham is willing to give up some things first. All right, and I think this is a really cool model of how we can be evangelizing to the world. It's really, I love theology. I love talking about it. I love talking about doctrine. I love studying this stuff really deeply and spending hours on it. But when I'm talking with somebody either out on the street or at a coffee shop or something like that about my faith, I don't just start piling theology things on them, and I don't just start, loading up the guilt and the shame and all this stuff. Man, you just meet people where they're at. You have something to share, just like God had something that he wanted to give to Abraham. We just share Jesus with people. We share Jesus' love with people. And what happens is the same thing that happens with Abraham. When we give our hearts to Christ, we go through a process. It's the same thing. When we place our faith in Jesus, most of the time, we're not automatically perfect people. We don't automatically fully understand the doctrine of God. We don't automatically fully understand perfect theology or anything like that. And a lot of times, we still struggle with sin. And we're going to struggle with that sin or different sins for the rest of our lives oftentimes. But God's okay with that. God doesn't require us to be perfect. God just requires a little bit of faith, and then he takes it the rest of the way. Which is a really cool story all throughout the book of Genesis too. Because these guys are failures. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Joseph is okay, but even at the end of Joseph's life, he has a cup of divination. What is he doing with a cup of divination? All right, these guys are failures. These are not perfect people. They don't have perfect faith, but they just have a little bit of faith. And they don't fully understand God. But we see in the book of Hebrews, and actually when you get to Hebrews, there's a few people in there that you might be pretty surprised to see in the book of Hebrews being called heroes of the faith. But that's all it takes for God and Abraham, is just a little bit of faith, and God takes it the rest of the way. And so, oftentimes, the covenant that God makes with Abraham is called an unconditional covenant. People will say, well, God didn't require anything of Abraham in order to do this. When we see the Mosaic covenant in Exodus, it requires the people to do something. It's a conditional covenant. So a lot of times people will say, well, the covenant with Abraham was unconditional because God doesn't ask him to obey certain laws. However, I see it a little bit differently. I still see this as a conditional covenant, because if Abraham did not respond in obedience to God, if Abraham did not go when God told him to go, then these promises would probably not be given to Abraham. Abraham still had to respond in faith. Abraham has to take a step of faith. And the reason, one of the reasons I think that this is when God first meets Abraham, Abraham is in a place called Haran. And so when we look at a map and we see that Abraham is from Ur, which is all the way down here, we've got to ask ourselves, what in the world is Abraham doing all the way up in Haran? And so it's one of those that's kind of tough to answer. But we know that when God calls Abraham, Abraham has to give up a lot of things. He has to give up land. He has to give up possessions. And so it very well could be that Abraham's father, and this is one thing that some scholars have suggested, it could be that possibly Abraham's father was first called by God to go to the land of Canaan, because they're already like halfway there. They've already left their home. I mean, what's the point of traveling all this way and bypassing a lot of other major cities and civilizations and going all the way to Haran? It could be that Abraham's father was called first, and if that's the case, it could be, and this is a big could be, all right? It could be that they just got comfortable in Haran, made some money, and just settled there, and then after his father dies, God calls Abraham instead, and Abraham actually responds in obedience. That's all a lot of circumstantial, kind of just assuming and guessing and things like that. But whatever the case, we know that Abraham is not actually living in his own home. Something had caused he and his family to settle in Haran. But when God appears to Abraham, Abraham gives up his land, gives up his inheritance from his father, gives up a lot of things, and he trusts in faith that this God that's speaking to him, this Yahweh, is going to do what he promises that he'll do. And God doesn't really give him much to rely on. God doesn't give him a sign right away. It comes later. But God just says, hey, like if you trust in me, if you put your faith in me, really just almost blind faith, then I'm going to reward you. But he kind of tests Abraham's faith at the beginning. If you're willing to give these things up and trust in me, then I will give you something new. And it's kind of the same thing with Adam and Eve. If you're willing to trust that I know what's best for you and not try to make these decisions on right and wrong by yourself, but trust in my law, then I'll bless you. And that's kind of what's going on with Abraham. And again, like we said, Abraham is from the east, and God is starting this recreation process because he's bringing Abraham to the promised land. And so we'll take a break. But the reason that I really wanted to at least give you guys a little bit of background on who Abraham was, where he came from, is to hopefully, again, it doesn't make these answers any easier. It still doesn't justify polygamy. But like, for example, God promised a son to Abraham. So Abraham's getting really old, and Sarah's getting really old. And so in their more pagan than righteous mindset, back then, if your wife had a maidservant, your maidservant was, and it sounds terrible, but your maidservant was just as much yours as your wife was. And so back then, to sleep with your maidservant was not equivalent to today, like having an affair with a maid or something like that. To sleep with your maidservant was almost like sleeping with an extension of your wife. Again, it doesn't make it okay because we see that it causes all kinds of problems for Abraham and his family and his son Ishmael, and especially for Hagar, which is really interesting because God kind of takes a tangent in the story of Abraham to show how he actually takes care of Hagar, even though Abraham, the man of God, the man that was supposed to be obedient and righteous, did not take care of her very well. And God does, which again shows that God not only has value for women, but he has value for women that have been cast out, that are pagan. God really cares for her. And so even though Abraham is not making good choices, God is taking care of these people that are being hurt by the bad choices of people that are supposed to be representing God. And so it doesn't mean that polygamy is okay, but we can kind of, I guess, see how and why maybe these guys would make that decision. It's a little bit more of a culturally appropriate decision back then. Doesn't make it right, and didn't make things easier. But that's kind of why Abraham made decisions like that. Same with giving his wife to the Pharaoh. Just like, here you go, take my wife, don't kill me kind of a thing. In his mind, he's like, well, God's promising a son to me, and I don't have that son yet, so I better, do whatever makes sense to me to protect myself and my wife. When he slept with Hagar, he's like, well, God said I was going to have a son. He didn't tell me at that point who that son was going to come from, so maybe it'll come from Hagar. So again, it doesn't really make those things easier. It doesn't make them right. It doesn't mean God is condoning those actions just because those stories are in there. But God does kind of creatively, it seems like, show that those things did not help these guys out. It made things even worse. And that's kind of just all from where Abraham is coming from. And then we get to the covenant, God's covenant with Abraham. So let's just take a look at this real quick here. God tells Abraham to go. All right, that's the very first thing he says. Go from here and go to the land that I will show you, which ends up being the promised land. And if Abraham goes, if Abraham lives and responds in obedience to God, then Abraham gets to enjoy these blessings, the blessings of this covenant. And the very first one is, I will make you a great nation. All right, and so when Abraham left Haran, Abraham basically is leaving his inheritance. His family seems like they had a decent amount of money. They had a lot of servants, a lot of cattle, flocks. And so by leaving Haran, he's leaving his homeland. He's leaving his inheritance. But God is still promising him that he will make him great. He probably would have done pretty well for himself in Haran. But God's like, if you trust in me, I'll make you an even greater nation than you could ever imagine, really, to be living in Haran. He also says that I will bless you and I will make your name great. And this all comes from the first few verses of chapter 12. But he also gives a reason why he's going to bless Abraham. It's not just self-centered. Back then, people are like, I want blessings from whatever God I'm worshiping so that I can flourish and so that I can be blessed and I can have money. But when God says that he will bless Abraham and make his name great, he says, so that you will be a blessing. And so God is blessing Abraham so that Abraham in turn will be a blessing to other people, which is important to remember with the entire people of Israel. Israel was chosen to be blessed by God, but the reason that they were blessed by God was so that they could be a blessing to other people. They were supposed to be a blessing to other nations. That's why God wanted them to be holy and separate and set apart, because they were supposed to be a light to the nations. And so that purpose starts right here with Abraham. God says, I'm going to bless you, but I'm doing it for a reason. I'm not just choosing one family here just to bless your people, but I'm choosing to bless you so that you in turn will bless other people. And we'll see more of that in a second. But then God says that he will bless those who bless Abraham, and he will curse those who curse him. And when he says curse, in both of these sections, he actually uses a different word in each one. And the first one that he uses when he says those who curse you, it's the Hebrew word kalal, which means to mock or make fun of, which is kind of an interesting concept. Kind of think of how that works out. I mean, Abraham's an old guy, shouldn't be having any kids. Maybe he faced some of that mocking, but it's more of just this despising. If people are looking on Abraham's family, or even today, if people are looking on the people of God in mockery, or they're despising us, or they're making fun of us, what God says is, I will curse them. And when God made this treaty, he said, basically, those who mock you or revile you, I will curse them, as in, like, I will destroy them. All right? And so God is going to be Abraham's strength and Abraham's shield. It's not just like necessarily like if someone makes fun of Abraham, God's going to smite them. But it's kind of this big, almost exaggerated language to just show that God is going to be the protection for Abraham and his family. He's leaving his homeland. He's leaving the city that he lives in, which means he's leaving his protection, and God's going to be the one to protect him and bless him. So whether it's blessings or cursings coming his way, God is going to be the one to take care of him. And then at the very end, we get kind of the kicker here. All right, he says, in you, all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. And that's really the big one here. That's really what shows that this covenant with Abraham was never just about Abraham. It was never just about Abraham's family. And it's really easy to get caught up in this idea that, and even today, there's certain veins of theology that have this idea that there is a separate salvation for Israel just because they're Israel. And then all the rest of us Gentiles have to place our faith in Jesus. It's called dual covenant theology. And I think where that comes from is kind of a misunderstanding of this covenant with Abraham. First of all, it's a misunderstanding that this was an unconditional one. But I think it's also a misunderstanding of what God's intent is. It's really easy to look at this and just think, oh, this is all about Abraham and the Israelites. But in fact, this is about the entire world. This is about blessing all of the families of the earth. Paul says in Romans that Abraham is called the father of many nations, not just the father of one nation, not just the father of Israel, but Abraham is called the father of many nations. And so when Paul uses this imagery in the New Testament that we're adopted into God's family, it's almost like Abraham is our adopted grandfather. And it's not special because of the bloodline. It's not like we become Jews when we we place our faith in Jesus, but we become children of faith just like Abraham was a child of faith. That's our inheritance. It's not a Jewish inheritance. It's God's inheritance. It's a faithful inheritance. And so the question is the old covenant still valid? Which is a good question because a lot of the early church struggled with this question as well. All of the early church, at least at the very beginning, primarily they were Jewish. And so they believed in Jesus, but they have thousands of years of history of being Jews that they got to figure out, what do we do with this now? Do we still have to be circumcised? Do we still have to adhere to these food laws? Do we still have to celebrate festivals? And then Gentiles start coming into the church. And like, do we have to make these Gentiles do all of this? I mean, here's my 40-year-old guy, this buddy of mine, and he just became a Christian. Do I have to tell this guy now that he has to go get circumcised? He can't eat bacon anymore. He's got to come to the temple with me. Like, how does this all work? And it was a huge argument in the early church. And so it's this whole issue is the old covenant still valid? Or in other words, I think the way it was worded yesterday was like, is it canceled out? Has it been done? Is it, and sometimes people will ask like, well, did that covenant just fail? And so God had to come in with plan B. And that's not really what happened. It's not that the plan failed. It's actually that the plan was fulfilled. And so when we look back at the Old Testament, we see different covenants. And I won't go into great detail with these. But we've got the covenant with Adam. And that's the promise that one day the serpent's head would be crushed. We got a covenant with Noah, and that was the promise that God would never again destroy the earth because of sin. God's going to deal with sin without having to destroy the earth. Then we got the covenant here with Abraham, and this was, make you a great nation, bless you, make your name great, and all that stuff. All the families of the earth will be blessed. We get the covenant with Moses. And that was where we get the law that comes into effect there. And that was kind of this idea that sin, again, needed to be dealt with. And then we finally have the covenant with David. And you guys will see that covenant with David as well. But just to kind of summarize real quick, just to kind of lead you guys into further study this year, what we see in the New Testament is that Jesus actually perfectly fulfills every single one of those covenants. But he doesn't always fulfill them in the way that the people thought they would be fulfilled. People kind of got into this mindset that a lot of these would be physical fulfillments. There would be a physical kingdom of Israel. There would be a mighty physical city of Jerusalem. There would be a physical king on the throne, like actually in Jerusalem at all times. They believed that they would physically, like the land itself was like the key. But what we see as time goes along, especially in the prophets, is that God really has a more he's got a bigger picture in mind. God's looking more towards a spiritual family and a spiritual land and a spiritual king, because Jesus is king now, but Jesus is not sitting on a physical throne here on earth. Jesus is seated at the right hand of his Father in heaven. And so Jesus perfectly fulfills all of these things. In Matthew, Jesus says, I did not come to abolish the law or the prophets. He didn't come to do away with it, to just erase them and start over from scratch. He says, I came to fulfill them. And that word fulfill is a really interesting word in the Greek. The word is plerou, which I'm probably butchering the actual pronunciation of it. But what that word literally means in English is you can actually flip the word fulfill around, and it means to fill full. And so Jesus took these old covenants that couldn't really bring any real salvation to people, and he actually filled them full with meaning and with a spiritual meaning, and Jesus fulfilled them. When Jesus was on the cross, he said, it is finished. All right? Not only is sin finished, but the way this old covenant, this old system of worship and being part of God's family, it's finished. The law no longer has hold over people. And so it's not that God ripped up the old covenants and was like, oh, this isn't working, I got to do something else. But instead, it's almost like God just stamped those old covenants, it is finished, and filed them away, and now we live in this new covenant. And so to answer this question, is it still valid? We do not any longer as Christians live under the rules of these old covenants. We don't have to adhere to the festivals or, abstain from eating certain types of food based on Jewish law. It's okay for us to trim our beards if we want to, eat shellfish and stuff like that. We don't have to adhere to those old laws, but the same standard is in place, which is love God and love your neighbor. And so that's kind of the standard of the new covenant that we live in. And so it's not that God, again, just got rid of the old covenant just because it wasn't working. He actually replaced it. And we see that actually in the book of Hebrews. And I'll read this, and then we can move on. But this is one of the things that I like to talk about. So, and like I said earlier this week, you guys are just stuck with me. So, Hebrews 8, chapter 13, says, in speaking, he just gets done quoting Jeremiah 31 and Isaiah 54. He says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. And so the whole topic of the book of Hebrews is, and it's written towards Hebrews, towards Jews, it's like, do we rely on this old covenant? Do we rely just on our Jewish heritage, or do we place our faith in Jesus? And the author just goes to great lengths to show, why would you place your faith in a dead system that never brought you salvation in the first place? Put your faith instead in this new covenant, because this old covenant is passing away, which the old covenant system of worship eventually did pass away when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, never to be rebuilt again. So there's all kinds of stuff for you guys to study. I just vomited a ton of information to you guys. But that's one of my favorite questions is the old covenant still valid? So does that make sense at least a little bit? Does that sound okay? You guys will get into the New Testament. You guys will read books like Galatians, Romans, Hebrews. Paul gets really fired up about some of this stuff. So, all right. And so the purpose of this covenant, though, again, God wants to recreate Eden. God wants a Garden of Eden. God wants a land where the land is prospering, it's blessed, and people are living there in relationship with God. God wants a place where he can walk with his people, he can rule with his people, and they're living in obedience towards him. And so Abraham is really continuing the call of Abraham, or the call of Adam. All right, Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply. All right, God is calling Abraham to be fruitful and to multiply. But Abraham is almost 100 years old, or he is 100 years old, right? And so God is calling Abraham to do something, but what's interesting is God is actually the one that's going to perfectly fulfill this calling. It's like God looks at Abraham and looks at mankind in our sin and in our fallen nature, and he says, I want you to be like me. I want you to rule with me. And guess what? You can't actually do it because of your sin. And so God is going to be the one to help us get to where we need to be. I mean, that was the whole point of Jesus. We messed everything up. We're the ones that threw everything into chaos. We're the ones that rebelled. And yet God steps in personally and fixes our problems. And so God calls Abraham to have a son, a man and a woman who should never have had kids, all right? Because physically, it was impossible to have kids at their age. And yet God says, I'm going to choose you to prove to everybody that this is me doing this. And I'm going to work a miracle through you, and you're going to be blessed through it for sure, but it's going to be God who's going to be the one to do it. And so because of this, all of the families of the world will be blessed. Jews and Gentiles will be blessed because of the family of Abraham. And so the author continues this idea here. In Genesis 15, Abraham just finishes this victory against these 5 different kings. And the covenant is affirmed in this vision that Abraham has. And what God is doing is God is actually appearing to Abraham, and God is giving this treaty to Abraham. Basically, it's set up in the way that old ancient treaties were set up. And so God is what they would call the suzerain king, or God is like the victorious king. And he has helped. What would happen back in those days is you'd have one king who had king over a big city, and he would help the king of a lesser city against their enemies. All right, and so Abraham has to fight against these 5 kings. There's no way Abraham should have won that battle, and yet God blesses him and helps him win that battle. So God is like this greater king. Abraham is this lesser king. And so what would happen back then is then this greater king in those days would come to the lesser king, and he would say, hey, look, remember when I helped you with this battle? Remember how great and powerful and mighty I am? Remember how I could squash you if I wanted to, but I choose not to? Because of all those things, I want you to basically work for me and represent me now. And they would start this treaty, and he would say, okay, if you obey me, if you don't rebel against me, then I'll bless you and things will go well. But if you don't obey me, basically the opposite will happen. All these terrible things will happen. And the book of Deuteronomy is actually set up exactly like one of those treaties. I don't want to steal that from whoever's teaching Deuteronomy. But God does it in a mini version here with Abraham. And so if Abraham does this, God brings him out and says, look at the stars. He said, you will have offspring like the stars in the sky. You will not, he's like, go ahead, try to count them. You can't count the stars in the sky. I've tried. I've gone up there and just looked up at the sky. You can't count the stars that are in the sky, which is a an interesting promise. The promise is essentially that the descendants of Abraham would be innumerable. However, if you went and counted all of the Israelites from the time of Abraham to now, it'd be a large feat, but you could probably number the amount of Israelites that have come from Abraham till now. It's a smaller people group. And so what this is doing, again, is pointing to the fact that Abraham will have children eventually that aren't actually Israelites. He's going to be the father of many nations. Trying to count every single Christian, every single believer that's existed from the beginning of the church until now would be a much larger feat than trying to count the Israelites and then count all the other believers that will come after this time period. And so the fact that God says your descendants will be innumerable, it's a huge blessing in the ancient world anyways. But it just shows that God is looking towards the bigger picture. He's looking towards more than just physical Israel. Yeah, Daniel.
I don't know if you have this planned in your talk, and if it throws off, then you can not do it. But can you maybe bring a little bit of understanding to the name change that Abram goes through Abraham to Abram to Abraham, if you have time or if you can?
Yeah. So let's take a look here at the name change of Abraham. I don't have it in here, but it's a good question. Okay, here we go. Chapter 17. All right, 17 verse 5. No longer shall your name become Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. So this is right after Abraham gets the covenant, or gets this sign of circumcision. And so, actually, you guys probably have the same Bible that I do, because I got this from the DBS last year. So if you take a look at those footnotes there, Abram means exalted father, but Abraham means father of a multitude, all right? Or another way to say that would be father of many nations, would be another translation of that. And so that just goes back to kind of what Paul says about who Abraham is. It's not just the father of one nation, it's the father of many nations. And that was, God is looking forward to the fact that not only Jews but Gentiles would also be coming into the family of God, and thus would, be able to call Abraham their father. And so, again, it's not like Abraham just decided that he's going to change his name. God is the one that decides that Abraham is going to change his name because of what God is going to do through Abraham. And so Abraham has to take a step of faith even just to go along with his new name now. I mean, it's his new identity. God is taking what Abram used to be and giving him this brand new identity and giving him this new purpose. So in a way, Abraham is being recreated. It's this new human race. And it's also kind of similar, that name Abraham is somewhat similar to the name Adam. Adam means mankind. And it's kind of some of the same roots there as the name Abraham. So God is just starting over with Abraham. He's going to start a new people, a new creation, and the goal is to have a land where God dwells with his people and reigns with his people, and his people are perfectly reflecting the image of God. All right, a new creation. And so to kind of confirm this promise, Abram has a vision. And so Abraham falls asleep, same language as when Adam fell asleep and kind of saw this vision of who Eve was. During this vision, God promises Abraham that his ancestors will be sojourners, or they'll be strangers in a foreign land for 400 years, which happened with the Exodus. That's about how long the Israelites were living in Egypt before Moses came along. And so God promises that this will happen. He kind of foretells this. However, he says that Abram will be buried in peace. So Abraham doesn't have to worry about this happening. He's going to be buried in peace. And then what happened was, before Abram had this vision, back then when the greater king and the lesser king would come together and they would have this treaty, what would happen is they would bring a sacrifice. So Abraham brings a sacrifice, and he cuts the sacrifice in half. And what would normally happen back then is he would have, let's see here. I can't draw at all. So here's a cow. Blah, he's dead. There's part of his body. They would cut the cow in half. All right, like that. That's a terrible cow. Anyways, they would cut it in half, and what they would do is each party would walk through the halves of this cow, all right? And so the greater king would walk through, and he'd have to walk through the blood and stuff like that. And then the lesser king would walk through, and he'd have to walk through the blood. And it was kind of just a ceremonial thing saying, like, we are uniting together in this covenant. I will hold up my end of the covenant. If you hold up your end of the covenant, the blood kind of binded them. And there was almost a sense of, like, if you reject me, this is what's going to happen to you, kind of a thing, or may this happen to you if you don't uphold your end of the bargain. And so in this vision, Abraham cuts this sacrifice in half. He has this vision, and in this vision, there's a smoking pot and there's a torch. I don't know what those specifically represented. We see a smoking pot and a torch show up later in prophetic writings in the book of Zechariah. But anyways, what they're symbolic of in some way, shape, or form is God. How they are specifically, I'm not sure, but basically what it's showing is this is God. And actually what happens is the smoking pot and the torch go through this sacrifice. All right, so we got the smoking pot and the torch here. But Abraham in the vision does not go through the sacrifice, does not walk through there. And so what that shows is that God is basically swearing by himself, I will do this. And so it's like, I know that you're going to mess up. I'm not even going to bother telling you not to mess up because I know you will. And yet God is going to uphold this promise even though Abraham and his descendants are not going to uphold their end of the bargain. And this, again, looks towards something even bigger than just this one specific covenant and this one specific family. This is exactly what Jesus did at the cross. Because when we see in the law of Leviticus, when we see what happens when we sin, when we see the punishment that comes because of sin, I mean, the wages of sin is death, by this covenant that God has laid out, we should die eternally because of our sin. And God knows that, and yet God comes in, and God is the only one that hangs on that cross and pays the way for us. And so this is God pointing towards the fact that he's going to do something bigger. God is going to fix our mistakes, which is incredible. It's incredible that he would even give us the time of day. I mean, we're the ones that rebelled against him. We had it so perfect. We had it so well. We had the law of God. Adam and Eve had this perfect relationship with him. And in a moment of stupidity and rebellion, they decided, I'm going to throw that all away. And so by our own sense of justice, God should have just been like, forget you guys. Like, if you're going to be rebellious, forget you. Like, I'll do this on my own. And yet God, all throughout the Old and the New Testament, is constantly pursuing this relationship with a people that are going to reject him. I mean, Jesus hung on that cross asking for forgiveness for those who were around him. And he hung on that cross knowing that there's going to be people that are still going to reject that pain and that suffering that he went through. But he did it because he's a God of love. And because he loves us, and because he loves people, and because he's decided in that love that he's going to be glorified through a relationship with people. And he's going to be glorified through saving people from their sin. He's not going to be a God that's glorified because of his violence or his destruction or just, sending everybody to hell. But he's going to be a God that's going to be glorified through redeemed people that live a life that's better than they could ever imagine. Not just physical blessings, but they live a life that's redeemed, and they have a life of joy and peace and hope because of what he's done. And so God is the one that fixes our problem. Abraham needed to be fruitful and to multiply, and the only way that could happen was for God to do it. And that's what I tell sometimes, like even students with SBS and DBS and some of these harder schools. I don't tell them to be fruitful and multiply, at least not during school. But I tell them, like, things like DBS and SBS, sometimes with the workload that you guys have and the amount of stuff that it is, sometimes it seems impossible. But that's okay, because in those moments, you have to rely on God. And when you have to rely on God, that's when you get to see him work in ways that you never would expect. And so that's what he does with Abraham. The families of the earth needed to be blessed, and God is the only one that can make that happen. And then, of course, like I said, God walks through that sacrifice. God is the one that promises to fix our unfaithfulness through his faithfulness. And so we look at a lot of stuff. And the rest of the Old Testament, like I said, I want to just focus on this and then get moving because we kind of have to. But after this, we see more of Abraham's family, and we see a lot of repetition. Abraham tries to give his wife to the Pharaoh and say that it's his sister. His son Isaac does the exact same thing. We got a lot of buildup for Isaac, like this promised child, and we don't actually hear a lot about him. We don't get a lot of his story, just that he's a lot like his dad. But then we get Jacob. Jacob means deceiver, and yet God takes somebody whose identity is deceiver and turns him into Israel, who ends up being the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Then we get Joseph, and again, Joseph's story is just, it's a more personal story, but it's a story of how mankind messes up and tries to do things the wrong way, and yet God fixes the problem by perfectly ordaining the whole situation. So even though Joseph's brothers tried to hurt him and tried to do something evil, God turns it into something good. And so just like with Adam and Eve, just like with the sins of Abraham and the sins of the people during Noah's time, I mean, there's a lot of evil going on in the world, and there's a lot of chaos, and there's a lot of disorder. But God is showing the Israelites all throughout the book of Genesis that he is in control of all of that. And all they need to do is just give him a little bit of faith. If they don't have to know what's going to happen. They don't even have to be perfectly obedient to him at this point. They just have to give a little bit of faith to God, and he's going to take it the rest of the way. And so that's what we see all the way throughout the rest of the story of Genesis. And just to kind of summarize, I know you guys have already read Genesis, but just to kind of summarize these things, some things that I think are important to remember as you study Genesis and you study the rest of the Pentateuch. The creation account, like we said yesterday, is about God creating purpose and order rather than creating the material universe. There is that verse at the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Boom, there you go. God did it. How long did it take him to do it? We don't really know. Did it all happen in a second, or did it happen over billions of years? Sure, either one. I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to be. But I also think that it's exciting as we continue to study the Bible, we realize that maybe there isn't such a clash between science and the Bible like we thought there was. Science doesn't necessarily have to be our enemy anymore. We don't have to reject it. But I think it'd be cool to continue raising up a generation of believers that use the Bible to illuminate science instead of using the Bible to maybe tear down science. Number 2. Mankind was always meant to work with Yahweh in a loving relationship with him. And we're going to see that we see it all the way throughout Genesis. You'll see it all the way throughout the Old Testament. The male and female were equally created in God's image. Another thing to remember is you guys go through the Old Testament, look at how God treats women. And look at how God saves women. One of the greatest stories in the book of Genesis, and it's so weird and so bizarre, is the story of Tamar. Do you guys remember the story of Tamar? And so in the story of Tamar, you've got Judah. All right, Judah is the son of Jacob, who became Israel. Judah is the firstborn. Judah is supposed to represent God, and he's supposed to be a righteous man. And so what happens is Judah has a son, and his son marries this girl named Tamar. And his son dies. And so by the kind of the cultural laws there, he was obligated to give her another son. Now to us that sounds like arranged marriage, but to them it was her lifeline, because if she didn't have a husband, or especially if she was a widow, that meant you had basically one of two options. You could die, or you could become a prostitute, because no one would want to marry you because you were a widow. They'd either see it as bad luck, or you were no longer a virgin, and so nobody back then wanted to really marry you unless you were. And so culturally back then, women were basically condemned to die if they were a widow, or like I said, become a prostitute. And so they had these laws to kind of take care of them. And so Judah gave her another son. And lo and behold, this other son dies. And so she comes to him again, and he's like, all right, I've got another kid, I've got another son, but he's too young. He's like, 6. I don't know how old he was. So you can't marry him yet. You got to wait until he's old enough to marry you. And so years go by, and she's waiting for this supposedly man of God to hold true to his promise. And that son gets old enough to marry, and he doesn't get them married. He leaves Tamar on her own. And so it turns into this weird story where Tamar dresses up like a prostitute. She sits on the side of the road. She seduces Judah, her father-in-law, and he ends up sleeping with her, and she gets pregnant. And so we hear that story, and we're like, that's super messed up. And it's funny because it's like right in the middle of the story of Joseph. I'm like, nobody ever includes that scene in Joseph movies. I don't know why. But But I think, and it seems like a weird random story, but God is showing in a way that even though these people made mistakes, Tamar made a wrong move. I mean, she was doing the best that she knew. It's really Judah who's at fault here, and she has to basically be a prostitute and trick her father-in-law, who's like super old and gross, into sleeping with her. And then she gets pregnant by him, and she, in a way, is redeemed because now she has a son, and the son can take care of her when he grows older, and she's taken care of. So it's an ugly story, and there's some messed up stuff going on, but God takes care of Tamar even when Judah does not take care of her. And Tamar ends up in Matthew chapter 1 as one of the ancestors of Jesus himself. And so God has an incredible amount of love, I mean, for everybody, but there's some really game-changing things in the story of Genesis and a lot of these, and especially when you get to some of the laws in Leviticus. Some of these laws geared towards women seem strange, but when you look at the culture and the context, you see how much love and care God really has, especially for women, especially for families and young children. But God starts off right away by telling people that male and female are equally created in God's image. See if we can get number 4 here. Number 4, God does not always immediately change a person in order to work with them. Didn't automatically change Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, a lot of people in there. He does not automatically change them. Abraham and his family are living in a typical pagan, ancient Near East society. So again, that hopefully helps with some of these questions about why they do the things that they do. God does not condone it, and it causes problems, but through God's grace and faithfulness, he still works with these people even though they make these mistakes. Did you have a question?
Yeah. I was just wondering why you're using the word Yahweh instead of God.
Yeah, so the question was why I use the word Yahweh instead of God. Every once in a while I've got God in there. I just get so ingrained in it sometimes that here in the Old Testament, I mean, Yahweh is God's name. It's the name that he gives here. And so that's really who is communicating here is Yahweh. So back then, I'm trying to get ingrained in their mindset. That's who they would say is Yahweh. That was the name that God gave them for himself. Good question, though. God's faithfulness always outweighs mankind's unfaithfulness, and he is always willing to work with a repentant heart. God lets these people have chance after chance, even though they've let him down, because he's committed to them. And then finally, God's plan was always about more than one family or people, and God is working to redeem and bless all people. It's almost break time. Before we finish, can I answer this question about Melchizedek? Because I think that kind of ties into that. I'll try to keep it simple. In the book of Hebrews, the author refers to Jesus as being from is it Hebrews or he does it in Hebrews, but I think he does it in Romans. I think Paul says something too. Anyways, I know in Hebrews he talks about Melchizedek. It says that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And so that verse alone has caused some people to think that possibly Melchizedek was Jesus, or at least a Christophany. A Christophany basically is Jesus appearing before the New Testament. And so there's a few places in the Old Testament where people maybe, think that maybe this was Jesus showing up. And one of those places is the story of Melchizedek. And what happens is Abraham wins this battle against these 5 kings, and then kind of out of nowhere, this high priest shows up. And this high priest's name is Melchizedek. And this high priest is like a priest unto the Lord. Like he's a priest of Yahweh. He worships Yahweh. And so it's kind of an interesting story because the story of Genesis is very one-sided. It's basically just one family story. But then all of a sudden we see this guy come out of nowhere who's a priest of God, and we're like, oh, I didn't realize God was speaking to other people or having interaction with other people. And Abraham gives him a tenth, gives him a tithe of all that he has. It's actually not all that he has. He just gives him a tenth of the stuff that he just won from this battle. That's not even technically his. But he gives him a tenth, and he basically blesses him and worships Yahweh. But then we don't ever see anything about Melchizedek in the rest of the Bible until we get to Hebrews, and the author says that Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. And the reasoning he gives for that is basically because Jesus has no beginning and end. And so when we take that kind of just literally face value, it's like, oh, does that mean Melchizedek has no beginning and end? Does that mean Melchizedek is eternal? Does that mean Melchizedek is Jesus? I don't think so. Just to answer it real quickly, I don't think that Melchizedek is Jesus. Other people do, and that's fine. I know people that are way smarter than I do that do think that he is Jesus. When the author says that he has no beginning and end, it's not that Melchizedek was not born. It's just that in their ancient mindset, your family was everything. So your family was your beginning and your end. And Melchizedek, nobody knew where he came from. So they didn't know his family. They don't even know how he was a high priest. I mean, this is before the priesthood was even established in the book of Leviticus. How is this guy a high priest? We don't know. We just know that somehow God must have been working with Melchizedek. And so when it says he had no beginning and no end, it's more of like a physical way. He's more of a type. I guess I should say he's a type. We talked about this yesterday. He's a type in the sense that like they didn't know his physical lineage, so they're like, oh, he doesn't have one, even though he really did. We just don't know it. But Jesus is the antitype. Jesus is the like actual fulfillment of that, because Jesus really didn't have. I mean, Jesus was born, but Jesus is eternal, so that's why they say Jesus has no beginning and no end, like Melchizedek. Melchizedek was kind of like the physical shadow of a spiritual reality in Jesus, if that makes sense. Yes?
What is A&E?
A&E, again, sorry, is Ancient Near Eastern Society. All right. I will get to this question tomorrow. Things that seem violent. We got Melchizedek. We talked about polygamy. What was the question with Leah one more time? I'm trying to remember what it was specifically. I don't remember who asked it.
It was just like, oh, thanks. It was just like why kind of like she was in the situation that she was in. Like you brought up that God really like looked out for women and stuff like that. But I understand God kept giving her like babies and stuff like that, but she didn't seem like she was really loved. Like she was in the background a lot. And then like when he went up to meet his brother, it even says like, oh, he put her in front of him. Yeah. Like, that's not cool. Yeah.
It's kind of I'm glad you asked that. It's actually, I'm remembering now. It's actually kind of a cool story. So he goes and he loves Rachel, right? Yeah, he loves Rachel. And so he wants to marry Rachel, and he gets tricked into marrying Leah first, which is kind of interesting. Let's see, I want to make sure I give you the right verse here. Let's see. I'm going to have to find it. I don't want to take too much time trying to find it. I'll find you guys the verse. But this is what happens, actually. So Jacob wants to marry Rachel. He falls in love with Rachel, works for 7 years, and ends up marrying Leah. Works for another 7 years, marries Rachel. Again, it's polygamy. It's bad. It's gross, but it happened back then. And so Rachel ends up being this, kind of this favored wife, and Leah kind of gets the short end of the stick, doesn't have kids. I mean, she eventually does. But actually, putting Leah in the front of the caravan was kind of a way that he was actually putting his best foot forward. So putting Leah first was almost showing that something changed, where he actually had some love and affection for Leah in a way that he never did. And when Rachel and Leah and eventually Jacob died, they actually, he was buried with Leah and wasn't buried with Rachel. And so, in a way, Leah kind of got the short end of the stick, but God still brings her children, and in a way, maybe, we don't know, we have to interpret this, but maybe she ended up getting the love and affection. Maybe that was the one that God always wanted him to be married to, was Leah. And he messed it up or something like that. I'm not sure. It's all kind of interpretation. But yeah, she kind of gets redeemed at the end of the story in a little bit. She actually ends up being the more honored wife out of them. All right, you guys want to take a break, and we'll just jump into a little bit of Exodus before the end of the day. So we looked at the book of Genesis. There's kind of a repeat of the creation event going on in there. So creation was a big moment in the Jewish history. The call of Abraham was a big moment in Jewish history. But like the moment to end all moments, all right, the event of all events in Jewish history was the Exodus from Egypt, from slavery in Egypt. All right, this was what every single Jew, every Israelite knew this story, and they knew it by heart, and they always looked back on it, and then they always used that as kind of the filter to look forward to the coming salvation that the Messiah was going to bring. And so a lot of us have these defining moments in our lives, and this was really the defining moment for the Jewish nation, was the Exodus from slavery. Some of us, we have these defining moments, and we kind of judge everything else in our lives based on that defining moment. Like I said yesterday, I've been married for a little over 10 years now to my wife, Jana, and I met her in high school. And so I went to a Christian high school, little public high school. We were very sheltered, really weird, probably. And a lot of the girls that I knew that were in my class, I had known since, like, kindergarten. So it was just weird to think about dating any of them, as if I had, like, tons of choices, like I was turning them down. It's not the case. But one day, at the end of my sophomore year, there was a new, our principal would give, like, new families tours of the school and stuff like that. Me and some of my buddies were hanging out, and we saw this new girl getting this tour of the school. And because it was a Christian school, in like and I went there in the 90s and the early 2000s, we had specific dress codes there. And like we weren't allowed to wear hats. Nobody could wear hats. If God wanted you to cover your head, he would have given you long hair or something. We couldn't wear shorts. So, like, even though if it was like 90 degrees outside, we couldn't wear shorts. And there were other rules. The girls had it way worse than the guys did. But the girls could not wear shirts that showed their shoulders. So no tank tops, no, cutoffs or anything like that. So this new girl and her sister were walking through the school getting a tour. And she was wearing, it ended up being Jana, but she was wearing a shirt where, like, you could see her shoulders. And so there's, like, 4 or 5 of us, like, Christian high school guys, like, oh, shoulders. Like, yes, who is this? And we found out that she was the new girl and that she was going to be there the next year. And so it was just, like, fresh meat. Like, so it was, like, this is a new girl. Like, the game was on to see who could bag her, which is a terrible way to think about it. But it was like, who's going to get her, who's going to go out with her, because we didn't want to date any of these other girls. Like, we had never seen their shoulders, so how can we know they were, like, a suitable wife? But she started our school our junior year, and somehow, some miraculous way, we ended up dating halfway through our junior year, and the rest is history. And so that was a defining moment for me, though. That's one of those moments that I'll always remember. I judge everyone else's shoulders based on my wife's shoulders, okay? That defined the rest of my life. I mean, it wasn't love at first sight, but it was just like, those shoulders, though. But that, led me down a path where I, went after her and we dated, and now we're married and living in Hawaii and have 2 amazing children. And that's a defining moment. When we got married, that's another defining moment. It's like one of those moments when I got married. in a weird way, I felt bad for my kids because I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to love any human being as much as I love my wife right now. But then you have your first kid. Emmett was born. And somehow, it's like in The Grinch, like your heart grows to make room for somebody else that you love with all of your heart. It's like, well, hopefully we don't have two kids because there's no way my heart's going to keep growing. But then you have another kid and your heart grows some more and makes room. But those are defining moments. I mean, no offense to you guys, but I don't like anybody as much as I like my family, all right? So I judge everybody else based on my family. No. But I do. I mean, you love your spouse and your kids, and those are huge defining moments. I mean, I don't get excited about anything as much as I got excited like the moment your child comes out and you see them for the first time and you realize the first thing is so weird. The first thing I ever did with my kids is I made sure I counted their fingers and their toes because I was so concerned that they wouldn't have enough for some reason. I was going to grab a fork. So yeah, I mean, it's those defining moments where you really view and judge everything for the rest of your life with those moments as your lens. And that's really what the Exodus was like for the Israelites. Everything else that happened to the Israelites, they viewed through the lens of the Exodus. And so when they were living in the Promised Land and these prophets started to come and prophesy against them, what the prophets would say is what's going to happen is you're essentially going to go back into slavery like you did in the Exodus. But even though you're going into slavery or you're going into exile, God is going to deliver you in a mighty way, just like he delivered you out of Egypt during the Exodus. And so even with messianic prophecies, Jesus, the Messiah, is prophesied a lot in terms of being a leader like Moses. And he's not only going to bring them out of physical slavery, but he's going to bring them out of spiritual slavery to sin. And so this is the moment that just everybody, and it's like if you talk to, somebody from America, or, like all Americans, or at least most, do, which I'm starting to run into people in SBS now that don't remember, like, the attack of 9/11, which means I'm just getting really old. But it's like one of those defining moments, the attack on the Twin Towers in 9/11, World War II. I mean, all these, there's big things that happen in different nations, and those are all kind of defining moments. And that's what the Exodus was for the Israelites. It's the event. And so if there's two things really that you guys remember from Genesis and Exodus, it's remember the creation account, all right, but also remember the Exodus. Remember these two events, because the Exodus itself is still like a recreation. It's a new creation. God is bringing his people out, and he's settling them in the land again, all right, creating this Eden. But these two things, if you guys just remember Moses, remember the Exodus, you guys will see imagery from this story everywhere, not just in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well. So this was the moment that every Israelite looked back towards, but is also the lens through which they look forward to all of God's future promises. And so just a little bit of history on when the Exodus actually happened. It does change a little bit how you interpret the events in the story of Exodus based on when you think it happened. There's been kind of an ongoing debate over the years between Christians and non-Christian scholars about when the Exodus actually happened. We don't have a ton of time to go over both. But basically there's an early date and there's a late date. The early date would place it pretty specifically right at 1446 BC. But then there's a late date theory that places it around the 1200s or 1200s BC. If you ever watched, what's the animated one? Prince of Egypt. Yeah, and then the one with Batman, Christian Bale. It's just Exodus. Yeah, Gods and Kings or something like that. Both of those movies are actually centered around this idea that it happened in the 1200s. I actually don't think that's accurate, and a lot of Bible scholars don't think that's accurate. Actually, most Bible scholars, if we're just looking primarily at the text itself, actually goes around with this date of 1446 BC. A reason that people go, actually there's only one verse that people base this whole idea about the 1200s is that when the Israelites are leaving, it talks about the cities of Pithom and Ramesses. And those cities were not actually built until Ramesses was the pharaoh around the 1200s BC. But what most scholars think is that when it says Pithom and Ramesses, that is just a later edit to the text or something like that, saying like the cities that you now know as Pithom and Ramses are the ones that they went through or the ones that they came out of. Not that that's what they were called back then. They were probably called something else. But that's just, anyways. So I mean, it's kind of like one of those things where now, nowadays, like in Kona, like where Kona Brew is at, like Island Naturals and stuff like that, we call that the old industrial area here in Kona. Back then, they didn't call it the old industrial area because the new industrial area by Costco didn't even exist. But nowadays, we would call it, if we were telling a story from 40 years ago, we might say, someone was walking through the old industrial area of Kona, even though back then that's not what it was called. That's what most scholars think is happening when they mention these other cities. They're just referring to what they're called now, not what they were called back then. And if you guys have more questions, you can always hit me up with that. But most people think that this happened around 1446, and this fits a lot better with Scripture and what Scripture says about when the Exodus happened, but it also fits really well with Egyptian history. And so we're going to look at a little bit of Egyptian history today too, and see how what I think I call the Exodus-shaped hole in Egyptian history. So support for the early date, around 1446. The tomb of Pharaoh Thutmose III, who was around about 15 years before the Exodus would have happened, because we're working with BC, so we're going, as we go back, the numbers get higher. They found his tomb, and inside of his tomb, oftentimes on their coffins, they would inscribe different history and events and stuff that happened during that Pharaoh's reign. And they talk about slave labor or foreign slave labor that was happening during Thutmose III's reign. And it's the same phrase that's actually used in Exodus 1:11 to describe who the Hebrews were to the Egyptians. They were foreign slaves. Not a huge piece of evidence, but at least we know that the Egyptians were building things using foreign slaves during this time period. The big one, though, and this is the one that you guys will probably memorize this verse. All of our SVS students memorize this verse because they have to, put dates for all of these books, and this is a big one to help out. This comes from 1 Kings 6, verse 1. And it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. All right, and so this is one of those verses that a lot of times Bible students just memorize and they refer back to when it comes to dating a lot of stuff in the Old Testament, because it says that Solomon started to build the temple in Jerusalem 480 years after they came out of Egypt. And so we do kind of have to take this with a grain of salt, because the Israelites were not, I don't want to say they weren't good at historical records, but they don't take historical records the same way that we do. A lot of genealogies got skipped if they just weren't important or exciting. But this isn't necessarily a genealogy. This is just saying this happened 480 years. Kings was actually also probably written close to the time of exile, and so they were a little more focused on exact details than they may have been if they were writing it earlier. But anyways, it gives us a good starting point. So if you go back 480 years from Solomon's 4th year, Solomon started reigning in 970. I should write this down just in case. All right, so it's 480 years from the Exodus. It's in Solomon's 4th year. All right, and so Solomon's 4th year, let me make sure I get this right. All right, so Solomon began his reign in 970, so his 4th year would be 966 BC. So if you add 480 to that, you do the math and you get 1446 BC. Another thing that kind of backs that up is the Jews keep track of time. Still today, Orthodox Jews keep track of time a little differently than we do. They have different calendars, different months. And they started a Jubilee calendar when God instituted the year of Jubilee, which was supposed to be every 50 years. And they started this calendar when the Israelites got into the land of Canaan under Joshua. And actually, if you count back, there's some, I have to look it up. I didn't want to spend a whole lot of time on this. But there's actually Jewish records that state the amount of Jubilee celebrations that they had since the beginning of their time in the Promised Land, which was 40 years after the Exodus. And if you count backwards, you actually land perfectly on 1446 being the date of the Exodus. So that's another thing that kind of helps out with that. Again, we don't have a lot of time to go into much detail about that, but I think that pretty solidly puts the Exodus around 1446 BC. Is it super important? Not really, but you can maybe impress your friends later on in life, or impress your parents, like you said, Chris, with knowing the date of the Exodus. You can watch The Prince of Egypt and be a snob and be like, no, that's not true. No. Because that really helps, with getting a girlfriend and stuff like that. All right, so kind of just to set the stage for the story of the Exodus. So last time, the end of Genesis kind of ends off on a high note. Joseph and his family are delivered from this famine. They're living under the good graces of the Pharaoh in Egypt. They're flourishing. They're alive. They're surviving. But then things start to get bad. Exodus begins 430 years after the story of Joseph. We see that in Exodus 12, verse 40. And what we see is that the events of Exodus line up actually with the 18th dynasty during what's called the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. And so the Egyptians were actually very good by the standards in their days. They were very good at keeping records, and we've discovered a lot of these records, or not me personally. But archaeologists have discovered a lot of these records, and they split the Egyptian dynasties or the Egyptian kingdoms up into an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a late kingdom. And it just kind of based on the time periods. And so the events of the Exodus actually line up with the 18th dynasty during the Middle Kingdom, and we'll look at that later on, either today or tomorrow. And so Joseph was part of the 12th dynasty, which was around during the early kingdom. When we look at ancient historical records based on this dynasty and the time that Joseph would have been around, this time in Egypt was actually a time where they were actually pretty monotheistic in the sense that they just worshipped one God. We're not exactly sure what God it was that they worshipped, but who knows? We can be optimistic. Maybe because Joseph and his family were there and Joseph was in charge, maybe they worshipped Yahweh, the one true God. We don't really know. We know that this was a very prosperous time for Egypt during the 12th dynasty. They made a lot of money. They didn't go to war very often during this time. They were at peace. And so maybe it could be that they were being blessed because Joseph and his family were there. Could be. A lot of times people think that Joseph was around during the reign of a pharaoh named Sesostris II. And that's just kind of trying to date back to who it would have been. So that was the end of the early kingdom. It switches after that into the middle kingdom because something pretty significant happens in Egypt's history at this point. And during Egypt's history, some people come in from the land of Canaan, a Semitic tribe, basically a band of shepherds. People have no home, no real land. They come from, I think, the Hittites. They come in and they actually overthrow the entire empire of Egypt. And this is a people group called the Hyksos. All right, a nomadic people who conquered and ruled ancient Egypt. So what happens is these guys come into Egypt and they have chariots. And Egypt doesn't have chariots yet at this point. So they're actually able to defeat the Egyptian army, and this band of vagabonds basically sets up shop and rules over Egypt for quite a few years. They kick the pharaoh out. They establish their own religion, their own government, and they're there for a while. So there are about 200 years of peace after the death of Joseph. But then, like I said, the Hyksos come in, and they come in for almost 200 years. And they ruled from 1710 to 1570 BC. And so the Hyksos came from the Hittite Empire. Like I said, they're Semitic people, so they actually came from the same bloodline as the Hebrews, same bloodline as like Abraham and his family. And so, of course, the Egyptians hated these guys. This is a very shameful part of Egypt's history. And in fact, it's pretty amazing that they even talk about the Hyksos, because we'll see later, the Egyptians and basically all ancient civilizations only recorded their failures if they really had to. And they really only recorded their failures as long as there was a good ending to the story. So a lot of times, we'll see from other civilizations that things were not always so great for places like Egypt and Assyria and stuff, but their own historical records don't talk about that because they don't like to talk about their failures. It makes them look weak, and it makes their gods look weak. And the only reason they actually talk about the Hyksos in Egyptian history is because eventually they overthrow them. But they were defeated in shame. They were referred to by the Egyptians as shepherds and as wild invaders from Canaan. And so they hated the Hyksos. The Hyksos also brought in Baal worship, possibly. They hated the Hyksos, but the problem for the Israelites was that the Israelites looked an awful lot like the Hyksos. The Israelites were from around the area of Canaan. The Israelites were shepherds in Egypt. That's what the Egyptians gave them, land to be shepherds. They spoke probably the same language as the Hyksos, looked and sounded like the Hyksos. And so what happens... Oh, I have something in there that got caught off. So what happens is there's a guy named Ahmose the First, and that's an old statue built of Ahmose the First. He reigned from 1570 to 1546. And Ahmose overthrows the Hyksos. They adapt the Hyksos style of warfare. Egypt builds chariots for themselves, and Ahmose overthrows them. He's the one that defeated them. And so Ahmose grew up under the control of the Hyksos, and he knew how shameful it was that his people were living underneath these guys. He hated the Hyksos. I mean, it's like he grew up probably just dreaming of a day when they could overthrow these Hyksos, and eventually they do. But what happens is after they overthrow the Hyksos, there's this group of Hebrews living in the land that look and sound and kind of do all the same things that the Hyksos do. And so in Exodus, when it says that a king comes up that doesn't know who Joseph is, it could be that that was Ahmose the First. It could be that he kind of forgets all the history about Joseph and the Hebrews and how they were at peace with the Egyptians. And it could be that he sees these guys and all he can think about is the hatred that he had for the Hyksos and sees that they're very similar to them. So it could be that he's very paranoid of these people. And it could be that's why he says, look, if these guys have way too many babies, if these guys continue to grow in numbers, they could overthrow us just like the Hyksos did. It doesn't say just like the Hyksos. But his fear is kind of validated because the Egyptians have already been overthrown. While the Hyksos were in Egypt, it could be that they had good relations with the Hebrews there because the Hebrews weren't Egyptian and they all came from the same bloodline. So it could be that the Hebrews and the Hyksos got along, but then the Hyksos get kicked out and now the Egyptians feel like they need to deal with the Israelites. And so it could be that Ahmose the First is the one that enslaves the Israelites because he doesn't know Joseph. He's paranoid that these guys are going to rise up and overthrow him and his family again, and he doesn't want that to happen. So it could be that Ahmose is the one that enslaves them. And then Ahmose has a son, and Ahmose's son is called Amenhotep. We get to go through a lot of these really cool Egyptian names here. And Amenhotep rules from 1551 to either 1526 or 1524 BC. And when we count back, so when Moses came to Egypt to lead the people out of Egypt, if it was 1446, And if we know that Moses was 80 years old, which he was a super old guy when he went to lead them out of Egypt, so not like the movies. Moses was 80 years old. That means Moses would have been born in about 1526 BC, which means that Moses was likely born at the very end of Amenhotep's reign. All right, and so Moses, he's really not very significant except for the fact that Moses is born at the end of his reign, and he's the father of this guy named Thutmose the First. All right, and you guys will get all of these slides, and so don't worry about, getting all of this information. Just enjoy the history, because this is kind of a fun story, I think at least. But I'm also a nerd, so he's the father of Thutmose the First. Thutmose the First is a big guy in our story, because if Thutmose the First was the next king during the line of the pharaohs, then Thutmose I was likely the one that ordered the death of all of the Hebrew boys. And there's kind of a debate on whether or not it was Thutmose I that killed the Hebrews or if it was his father, Amenhotep. But a lot of scholars think that Thutmose I did it at the very beginning of his reign, so like right after Moses was born, because he really wanted to establish how serious he was about protecting the Egyptians. It could have been that, his grandfather Amos was paranoid of the Israelites and he enslaved them. Maybe Thutmose thought that his father Amenhotep was just too easy on them. So it could be that he wanted to start off his reign with a pretty dramatic show of force against these Israelites. And so some scholars think that could be the case. And so it could be that Thutmose I was the one who ordered the death of all of these Hebrew babies. And I think he makes sense, too, when we look at some stuff later on. There are also archaeologists that believe that the Great Sphinx was built during the reign of Thutmose I. So it could be that the Great Sphinx was built by Jews. Could be. Maybe that's why, maybe, that's a terrible joke. Never mind. Let's say maybe that's why the nose is missing, because Jews are notorious for having big noses. Maybe it got, never mind. That was bad. And so Thutmose I then would have been the father of the daughter that found Moses, would have been his daughter. And that makes things very interesting, which we'll see in a second, all right? It gets kind of confusing here for a little bit, so just kind of bear with me. Thutmose I had a daughter named Hatshepsut. I got to say it right. Hatshepsut. And she was a very famous person in Egyptian history. And I really believe, and a lot of scholars believe, that Hatshepsut was the mother of Moses, at least the adopted mother. And so she would have been about 10 years old when she pulled Moses out of the water. And Hatshepsut was actually the only offspring, the only child of Thutmose I and his original wife. But the problem was, she was the firstborn, but she was a woman. And there had never been a woman pharaoh before in Egypt. And so Thutmose I felt pretty ashamed that he didn't have a son. So he took another wife, and with this wife he had Thutmose II. So it was his firstborn son, but it wasn't actually his firstborn child. Amenhotep was, which makes for a very interesting dynamic. And so he would have been, eventually he becomes, which is kind of weird, the stepfather to Moses, because what happens is Thutmose I, his dad, doesn't want his daughter to be Pharaoh. He wants his son to be Pharaoh, but he also knows that his daughter deserves it because she's the firstborn, so he actually marries his daughter and his son together, which is kind of messed up. And so Thutmose II becomes the stepfather / uncle to Moses. Weird, but I guess that's just how it would have been. However, Hatshepsut, Moses' stepmom, rightfully so, has no interest in sleeping and producing children with her brother. And so Thutmose II dies at a young age, but not before he had a son with another person, because his sister did not want to have a baby with him. He ended up having a baby named Thutmose III, who ended up co-reigning with his stepmom, Hatshepsut. Again, I know this gets really confusing. I get confused reading through it too. But basically, we've got Hatshepsut, who's the rightful heir to the throne, but she's a woman, gets married to her brother. Her brother dies, and so she's supposed to be the pharaoh now, but what happens is Thutmose III ends up co-reigning with her. That's like her stepson or something like that. It gets really messy, especially for Moses. But one of the cool things is they've actually excavated Thutmose III, and there he is. That's what he looks like today. I don't know. I think he's aged pretty well. It's gross. It's gross, but it is pretty amazing what, like, the Egyptian mummification process does, because that's what they look like today. I mean, you can still see the guy there. I mean, you can see the shape, you see his face. I mean, it's pretty wild. But that's Thutmose III, all right? And so Thutmose III then would be like the stepbrother of Moses, okay? So just keep that in mind. But let's go back to Hatshepsut here. Hatshepsut was the adopted mother of Moses. And what happened is because she co-reigned with her stepson Thutmose III, she actually became the first female pharaoh. And so not only was Moses raised in the courts of Pharaoh, Moses was actually raised as the adopted son of the very first female pharaoh, if this all, lines up as well as it looks like it does. And so Moses really would not just have been raised as a noble, but in a way, because Moses was the adopted son of Hatshepsut, Moses would have been trained up to essentially take the throne of Egypt as the son of the rightful heir to the throne in Egypt. And so it could be that Moses was on track to become the next pharaoh of Egypt. It doesn't work out that way, and we'll see why. One of the biggest reason is because of the issue of Thutmose III, his stepbrother. His stepbrother, because he was born to Thutmose II, there's kind of this weird tension between Amenhotep and her stepson, Thutmose III, as to who is supposed to be the rightful pharaoh. And actually, when Egyptian records talk about Hatshepsut, she was actually one of the most successful pharaohs. They actually look back in really serious fondness over her reign because she was a great ruler. They appreciated her. It was weird that she was a woman, so she actually wore fake beards sometimes. There's paintings of her with beards that she would put on just to look more like a man. But she actually, according to records, was a pretty successful ruler. And Thutmose III was a little younger, so she had a period of time where she basically was the ruler. Even though they said he was a co-pharaoh with her, she actually was running the country and did a really good job. And so Moses' mom at this point is the leader of the most powerful empire in the world. And they've also found Hatshepsut. That's what she looks like today. Not as good as Thutmose III. All right. And you can actually, I think she's in Cairo. You can actually go to the Museum of Egyptian History in Cairo, and you can actually see these mummies who very well could have been the characters in these stories, the people in these stories. So you could go check out Moses' mom if you wanted to. She's just hanging out. All right. And so here we go. It just gets even more twisted. Make sure I get all the names right here. I'm getting ahead of myself. All right, and so Hatshepsut declared herself the true ruler of Egypt in 1504 because Thutmose III was so young. She was a very famous ruler. This was during another time of peace and prosperity. But as Hatshepsut started to get older, the question came up, who is going to be the next king? Is it going to be Thutmose III, her stepson, or is it going to be Moses? Because officially, technically, Moses was her actual official son by adoption, and so the issue comes up. Who's going to be the next pharaoh? Is it going to be Moses, or is it going to be Thutmose III? And eventually, history tells us it was Thutmose III. There's Egyptian records. It doesn't talk about Moses, but what it says is that Thutmose III became the next pharaoh basically because he gained favor with the people. And so that makes us question, why would he have to gain favor? Shouldn't he have just been the next pharaoh? But it could be that that's part of this Exodus-shaped hole that, he had to gain favor over Moses. And like I said, one of the big reasons why people question, the biblical accuracy of Egyptian history is there's no Egyptian records really about the Hebrews or about the Exodus or anything like that, or Moses or anything like that. But a big reason for that, and even non-Christian scholars would agree with this, a lot of them, they say that, well, that's because there's no happy ending really for Egypt with the story of the Hebrews. They include the story of the Hyksos because they're eventually victorious. But if you're an ancient civilization that wants to be proud and appear mighty, there's really no way you're going to include the story of how Hebrews overthrew you or slaves overthrew you and you never really fully recovered, because Egypt never really did fully recover after the Exodus. And so that's why a lot of scholars believe, because a lot of ancient civilizations would do that. They would leave out embarrassing stories because they didn't want to be remembered for their failures or their faults. They wanted to be remembered as victorious. And so if you're the Egyptians, you're probably going to leave this chunk of history out. However, there's little breadcrumbs within Egypt's history that make it seem like they're trying to cover something up. And this could be part of it. When they say that Thutmose III won because of a popular vote, essentially, it's like, well, why would he need to have a popular vote if he was the rightful king? Well, it could be because the adopted son of Hatshepsut should have been the rightful king, and that would have been Moses. And like we said, he co-ruled with her for a while until she died, once he was old enough to co-rule. And so it's likely that Thutmose III was the one that tried to kill Moses. And so think about this. Thutmose III becomes Pharaoh. I mean, the first thing you're going to do as Pharaoh is you're going to get rid of any threat to your throne, and Moses would have been the most obvious threat to that throne. I mean, I always kind of wondered if Moses was the son of the Pharaoh, and he killed an Egyptian, why does that matter? I mean, if the Pharaoh was seen as God, their children were kind of seen as forms of deity as well. He should be able to kill whoever he wants. I mean, it sounds awful, but why does he have to run for his life just because he killed, a soldier? Not to demean their life, but why is it that big of a deal that he has to run away? Well, if Thutmose III finds out that his stepbrother, who's the rightful heir to the throne, who's really his only threat to the throne, but he's also a Hebrew, if he finds out that he killed an Egyptian, that could be his way to get rid of the threat to the throne. If he finds out that Moses killed an Egyptian, that's his end. He's like, that's how I get rid of Moses. I show everybody that he's a traitor to the Egyptians. I kill him, and everything's fine. So what happens is Moses runs away. Moses flees. And it's interesting because Moses lives in the wilderness for 40 years, which is just 4 years longer than Thutmose III reigned. So when God shows up to Moses in 1446, and he says to him in Exodus 4:19, those that wanted you dead are now dead, that was 4 years after Thutmose III died. And so it could be that Thutmose III died. God waited a couple extra years to make sure the rest of his cronies were dead. And then God shows up to Moses and said, those that wanted you dead are now gone. Now you can come back to Egypt, and you don't have to worry about getting your head chopped off or anything like that. All right? And so it's kind of this Exodus-shaped hole. Thutmose III is the one I mentioned earlier. He's the one where his tomb, and actually it was the tomb of one of his servants, royal servants, was found, a vizier, which was a servant. And his tomb was the one that had writings about using foreign slaves to help build their buildings. And you can also see Thutmose III in Cairo today too, and there he is. It would be the stepbrother, if it all works out. Theoretically, he would be the stepbrother of Moses, and he would be the one that wanted him dead. All right, we got a couple more minutes, and we'll finish this up, because this stuff gets pretty cool, I think. And so there's Thutmose III. Thutmose III had a couple of sons, if I remember correctly. One of them died, and then the second one was a guy named Amenhotep II. All right, no, I'm sorry, he named Amenhotep after his great-great-grandfather, so this was still his firstborn. Amenhotep was the next king, and so yes, Daniel.
I have a question over here. Rachel?
I was just going to ask, how did Moses know that Thutmose wanted to kill him?
That's a good question. It could just be that Moses could have known that like his stepbrother was after him just because, maybe he was paranoid. And so as soon as Moses kills this guy and finds out that other people know about it, it could be Moses is like, I should probably get out of here. It could be that he knew possibly that his brother might want to kill him after hearing that. Yeah. Yes.
And so then, if it was Tutmosis the third who was in rule, if it was Tutmosis the third who was in rule, then or Pharaoh, when Moses killed that guy, his mom Heshepha, she would have been already dead.
She was dead. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
okay,
She was dead already. Yep. So Moses' mom had passed away. That's why Tutmosis III was the next official pharaoh. And so Tutmosis III had a son named Amenhotep II, named after his grandfather. So Amenhotep II would have been the pharaoh of the Exodus then. Egyptian records talk about him as being a prideful king, which makes sense because he's got a pretty hard heart during the story of the Exodus. They also said he was a hunter. He would go out on like archery parties and shoot foxes and stuff like that. It's very interesting though, because Amenhotep II, Egypt had been kind of living in a time of peace. They were building pyramids, building sphinxes. I mean, when you're not going to war, you have time to build these monuments. So during the time leading up to Amenhotep II, they really didn't do much with their military. But Amenhotep II decided that he was going to start to expand Egypt's borders, and so he beefed up their military and started to go out on these military conquests. But something very mysterious happened in the year 1446 BC, which would have been the year of the Exodus. But Egyptian records talk about how his military conquest mysteriously stopped in 1446. Now, why would your military conquest stop in 1446? I mean, if your army's at the bottom of the Red Sea, you can't really do military conquests anymore. And so this is another one of those things where there's really no explanation for why their military conquest stopped. They just did. There's no explanation for it. And you can actually go see Amenhotep II, too. He's in Cairo. A real quick story about the guy named Brian, who is my SBS leader. He went to this museum and took pictures. Oh, you can't take pictures, I guess, while you're in there. These are official ones. But he went in there, and he said, like, one of the nerdiest moments of his entire life is he went up to Amenhotep II and, like, leaned over his coffin and said, "Let my people go." Ultimate nerd moment. He still can't get away from it. Poor Amenhotep II. He's like, "Just leave me be." But they found him, and now we get to torture him. So really interesting, though. Amenhotep II would have been, if it all works out, would have been the pharaoh during the Exodus. And there's one more piece of evidence I want to give you guys that just makes this seem like it makes even more sense. The next son that ruled after Amenhotep II was a son named Tutmosis IV, all right, named after his grandfather. But very interestingly enough, Tutmosis IV was actually the second born of Amenhotep II. They talk about his firstborn, but all of a sudden, just in Egyptian records, the firstborn just is not there. They stopped talking about him. They say that Tutmosis IV was his secondborn, and they say that it's strange that he was the next pharaoh, but why would the secondborn of Amenhotep II be the next king instead of the firstborn? His son died, right? If his son died during the plague, all right, it could very well be that that's why Tutmosis IV became the next pharaoh of Egypt. It's a really bizarre thing. The Egyptians were really great at keeping track of pharaohs and their sons, but all of a sudden they talk about this firstborn son, then all of a sudden they just stop talking about him, and the second-born son is now the pharaoh. Kind of a weird little thing. And so there's Tutmosis IV right there, kind of the last one there. All right? And so I just do this just because I like history, and the history around the story of Exodus is a really cool story. I think it helps to go kind of solidify that what the Bible says is actually true, and if there are archaeological finds that maybe don't link up with that just yet, probably means that we have yet to discover a lot of things. But what we have found so far it really seems like there's like what I call this Exodus-shaped hole in Egypt's history. A lot of these weird inconsistencies that finally make sense when we kind of plug the story of the Exodus into that. So just some interesting stuff to get you guys excited for tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll finish up Exodus. It'll be my last day with you guys tomorrow. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So thank you guys.